simple digestion, where the large macromolecules down into smaller ones. And then those are absorbed into the internal environment, the tissue fluid and the plasma. We also secrete things into the digestive tract, like hydrochloric acid, just to give one example. Mucus, give another. So we also need a proper motility so that things move down the digestive tract in a proper rate, not too fast and not too slow. The layers of the esophagus and the GI tract include these four major ones that we've mentioned. Now we'll go into them a little bit more detail. The four layers, starting from the lumen, the hollow space, and going out, the layer next to the lumen is called the mucosa. Essentially, a mucosa is primarily an epithelium and a connective tissue. But in reality here, it's an epithelium, a connective tissue, and then a small layer of muscle. We call the muscle layer there the muscularis mucosae. So the mucosa is epithelium, a little bit of connective tissue. It's called the lamina propria in this digestive tract. And then a layer or two, fairly thin layers of muscularis mucosae. All of that makes up the mucosa.
For the epithelium for the GI tract, is it pseudostratified ciliated or is it a simple columnar?
So it depends on where we are, but essentially in the places where a lot of wear and tear, where you don't need a lot of absorption or secretion, it's non-keratinized stratified squamous. This includes the mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus, and the anus. Having said that, there are patches in the mouth, like the palatine, or the palatine bone, or the palatine roof of the mouth, that can be keratinized or parakeratinized, but it's stratified squamous. And there's part of the anus that goes to the exterior that is keratinized, it becomes keratinized. But essentially it's stratified squamous. In those areas where you've got a lot of wear and tear. The stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine are all simple columnar. So that's fairly easy to remember. It's generally either stratified squamous or simple columnar. Simple columnar is really good for absorption and secretion. And so that's why it makes sense, perhaps, that it lines the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine. Now, there are variations that we'll see. The stomach has a lot of mucous epithelial cells. They're simple columnar, but they secrete mucus, but they're non-goblet mucus secreting cells. They don't have that shape of a goblet. The small intestine and large intestine have simple columnar with goblet cells, for instance. So there's a little bit of variation, but it's all simple columnar in those areas. So that's the epithelium. The lamina propria also has some variation as we go down, and so does the muscularis mucosae. In most places, the muscularis mucosae is 2 layers. In the esophagus, it's usually 1, for instance. There's a little bit of variation. The submucosa is connective tissue. And again, usually, most commonly, it's dense irregular connective tissue. The lamina propria tends to be loose connective tissue. So there's some differences there, depending on the region that you're in. The muscularis, sometimes called the muscularis externa, same thing, is larger muscle layers, and often, most frequently, is 2 layers. Sometimes it's 3 layers, sometimes it's even more, but usually it's 2 layers. but these are bigger, thicker layers. This layer is the one that's good for pulverizing food and moving it along. Then the outer layer is either an adventitia or a serosa. It's called an adventitia, remember, if it doesn't have a mesothelium line. It's called a serosa if it does. So these are very similar, but there is some differences. And again, it depends on where you are. In the esophagus, you have an adventitia. There's no mesothelium around it. But much of the tract has a serosa. Now this will make your head spin a little bit, but this is kind of a reference. It shows all of these main structures, and it gives you the type of epithelium, the characteristics of the lamina propria, the layers of the muscularis mucosae, the submucosal characteristics, and the layers of the muscularis externa. And again, in most cases, it's two layers with an inner circular and outer longitudinal. But in the stomach, it's got some extra layers, for instance. So we see some of that variation there. We start by looking at the esophagus, which conducts the swallowed food from the pharynx, the throat, essentially, down to the stomach. The esophagus has this somewhat stellate appearance. That sort of means like star-shaped or C-star shaped, and it's often partially collapsed. It doesn't have any cartilage in it, like the trachea that keeps it open. So it can be partially collapsed, as we see here. And we see an epithelium and a lamina propria and all that. It's a little hard at this magnification, only being 8. But we can see it. This may make it too dark. I don't know. Probably make it pop a little bit more. The epithelium, as you would expect, is non-keratinized stratified squamous. We don't really have much absorption or secretion here, but we do need the wear and tear, and so we have non-keratinized stratified squamous. Sometimes you'll see some precipitation of material in the lumen. Don't confuse that as keratin. There's no keratin in the esophagus. There's a submucosa. This is the muscularis externa. You can see it here. A little bit of adventitia there. And notice inner circular layer and outer longitudinal layers. We'll see those better in a higher magnification. At the lamina propria, you can have some glands, mucus secreting, and in the submucosa, you have some mucus secreting glands that are called esophageal glands proper, if you will. Usually we only have one layer of muscularis mucosa, but we'll show you one slide where we see an exception where we have 2 layers, but that's an exception. The upper third of the esophagus, approximately, has skeletal muscle in its muscularis externa, voluntarily controlled. The middle third is generally a mixture of skeletal and smooth, and the distal third is smooth muscle. We use the terms proximal and distal. Proximal means closer to the mouth with a digestive tract, and distal means closer to the anus. So we're going from proximal to distal. The esophagus is primary function is peristaltic activity, peristalsis, and it moves the swallowed food and liquid down to the stomach. This is another view with kind of an interesting stain. Here's your epithelium. Here's your muscularis mucosae. Now you can see that that's in cross section there. Just a word about that. There's a couple ways you can make cuts. If this is our gastrointestinal tract, Okay, it's running from the mouth to the anus, it's coming up and down, it's like this. So if you have longitudinally oriented muscle, it's gonna run up and down. And if you have circular, it's gonna run around. The thing is, if you do a cross section and you cut it, those orientations will look opposite. We have to remember that the muscle is still longitudinal, but if we cut it across and we look at it in cross section, instead of longitudinal, it'll look circular. So we're gonna have to keep that in mind a bit. Here you can see that this muscle is running longitudinally, but it looks like cross section. We're seeing the ends of the muscle because we've cut it across in cross section. And here we see the big muscularis externa layers. We could see some plexi in here, like the Arbox plexus or the parasympathetic plexus. If it's in the submucosa, we call it the submucosal or myenteric plexus. So we have some different names for the ganglion, the plexi in there. This is a more typical H&E stain, and it looks quite nice. Here we see the non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. This is our lamina propria, right here, and this is our muscularis mucosa. Do you see how we're seeing the ends of this muscle? This would be smooth muscle here. This is our submucosa. We see a little bit of glands there. These are blood vessels. And then we see the muscularis externa. So we're seeing a couple different layers here. Again, we could see ganglion in between here very often if we look around. Now we're seeing here's the epithelium, and we've cut it lengthwise in this section. So here we have, well actually here we have two layers. So we have an inner circular and an outer longitudinal. So usually we only see the longitudinal. But this muscularis mucosae has two layers, here and here. So we see some muscle here, and then some coming out at us here. This is the lamina propria. Often it's not very big in the esophagus. There's some blood vessels, and you see some veins and a little arterial there, probably. And out here would be the submucosa and then the muscularis externa. Here again is the epithelium, the lamina propria. We generally would classify this as loose connective tissue here. Here's our muscularis mucosae. It's longitudinal, but in cross section it's coming out at us. And here's our submucosa. Usually that's classified as dense irregular connective tissue. And then here's part of our muscularis externa with the different layers. This has a special staining to stain for the mucus glands here, and that of course gets secreted into the lumen and is protective. We can see the non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium quite well here, and here's our muscularis externa.
Could you go back, I think, 2 pictures? Oh, one more. You see on like the little like space kind of by the lumen? Yeah, right there. What is it? Is that a lumen?
That's a vein.
That's a vein? Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to check.
Could be a lymphatic, but I think it's a vein.
I think you're right.
Now, when we get to the stomach secretes hydrochloric acid into the lumen. We call the swallowed substance that's arrived into the stomach, we call it chyme. It's kind of a semi-solid now. And we're going to have in the mucosa and submucosa some folds called rugae. These folds, and we'll see them in a lot better, these folds help allow the stomach to stretch out while we're eating, like an accordion a bit. We have both gastric glands and gastric pits in the stomach. Gastric glands, if they're exocrine, they're going to secrete something into the lumen, like hydrochloric acid or mucus. If they're endocrine, they're going to secrete hormones into the blood. We'll see that there are different parts of the stomach as well. Again, lamina propria is loose connective tissue. Muscularis mucosae has primarily a longitudinal layer, maybe a circular layer. This just shows you in gross anatomy some of these structures. Here's the liver, the diaphragm, the spleen, which is not part of the digestive system, but it's part of the immune system that we looked at. Here's the stomach right here. Kind of looks like a J shape. And then we have the mesentery, the greater and lesser omentum. This is part of the large intestine here. This is part of the small intestine. Here's the stomach with the liver partially reflected back. This is the gallbladder here. And the stomach is described as having kind of a J shape. Kind of looks like the letter J. And again, the spleen is over here. This is the liver partially reflected. When we look at the stomach, here comes the esophagus. The initial part of the stomach is called the cardia, or the cardiac region. This upper region here is called the fundus, and then it goes to the body. The fundus and the body are histologically the same, so we don't really make much of a distinction histologically between the fundus and the body. And then as it comes narrowing, it's called the pyloric stomach. The rugae are these folds that we see here. We have several sphincters along the digestive tract. A sphincter is like a muscle gate that can close and open. This is the first of the sphincters that we'll pay attention to. Like many things, unfortunately, it has several names. It can be called the cardiac sphincter because it's right there between the esophagus and the cardia of the stomach. It can be called the lower esophageal sphincter. It can be called the esophageal gastric sphincter. In any case, this sphincter opens when we're going to swallow and allow food and liquid to come into the stomach. And then it closes so that the stomach contents don't reflux back into the esophagus. When we get hydrochloric acid or gas with hydrochloric acid in it refluxing into the esophagus, it can have that a little burning sensation on the mucosa of the esophagus. We call it heartburn. It really doesn't have anything to do with the heart. It's more like esophageal burn, but it feels like it's from our heart, so it got the kind of the misnomer of heartburn. The exiting of the stomach, we have a pyloric sphincter between the stomach and the first part of the small intestine, the duodenum. The pyloric sphincter opens in little bursts to allow food from the stomach to go into the duodenum. We have to regulate the exiting of the chyme from the stomach to the duodenum for two primary reasons. One is we need to neutralize the acid coming from the stomach into the duodenum. So we don't want too much of the acidic chyme coming into the duodenum too quickly. We also, because the duodenum is much smaller in diameter than the stomach, we need to regulate the volume that's coming. This shows you a dissection of the stomach with the rugae illustrated here. The submucosa is generally dense, irregular. Number of cells like fibroblasts and lymphoid cells. You can see nerve plexi and ganglion, they're called the Meissner's, or the submucosal plexus here. You can also see arteries and veins and the like. The muscularis externa usually has an oblique running layer as well as circular and longitudinal layers. Between these muscle layers you can get Auerbach's plexus, or the myenteric, or the parasympathetic, any of those names that we've seen in the nervous system. We'll see it again here. The serosa has a mesothelium, so it's connective tissue with the mesothelium, so it's called a serosa. This is the junction. We're going to be learning several junctions. This is the first one. This is the cardiac junction, again also known as the lower esophageal junction, or also, it's a sphincter junction. So notice that the epithelium, non-keratinized stratified squamous of the esophagus, makes a rather abrupt transition to the simple columnar epithelium of the stomach. So this helps us see that we're at the junction. We generally have a thicker area, layer of muscle here, and that helps make up the sphincter. These are the gastric pits and the gastric glands here. This shows it at a higher magnification, and notice this abrupt change in epithelium from non-keratinized stratified squamous of the esophagus to the simple columnar of the stomach. Notice how light staining these simple columnar cells are in the cytoplasm. We see the nucleus quite well elucidated, but the cytoplasm, this is because these secrete mucus, but they don't have the shape of goblet cells. So these are non-goblet cell mucus secreting cells, and they secrete a lot of mucus. It's very important to secrete a lot of mucus into the lumen of the stomach because of the acidic contents. We need to have at least 1 millimeter thick of mucus lining the mucosa of the stomach to help protect it from autodigestion. This is the lamina propria here, and you can see it's a loose connective tissue. A lot of these cells would be from the lymphatic cell category: lymphocytes, neutrophils, eosinophils, plasma cells, for instance, phagocytic cells. And of course, this is helping to protect from pathogens that might be absorbed here. We could also call this a type of loose, or diffuse lymphatic tissue, couldn't we? We have a lot of lymphatic cells here, but it's not organized into a lymph nodule. So this could be a diffuse lymphatic tissue here. That would be part of the GALT, wouldn't it? The gastro gut associated lymphoid tissue. And we'll see that all along the tract.
Are we able to see parietal and chief cells? Like, are they histologically?
We're definitely going to see those.
Okay.
Beautiful cells. The exocrine secretions: mucus. Parietal cells that Spencer was just mentioning secrete two things: hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. Chief cells secrete pepsinogen, which is activated by acid in the lumen to pepsin and begins protein digestion. Endocrine, meaning it's going to go into the blood vessels, into the blood. We have enterochromatin-like cells secreting histamine, serotonin, and then G cells secreting gastrin, D cells secreting somatostatin. These are parietal cells secreting hydrochloric acid. These parietal cells can be stimulated to produce more hydrochloric acid with gastrin, histamine, acetylcholine, part of the vagus parasympathetic response. They could be inhibited by somatostatin. We won't go too deep in that. That's really physiology that you all had not too long ago, right? So that gives you some of that. These are the gastric pits and gastric glands. You don't need to worry about memorizing all this, but these are a number of hormones secreted in the gastrointestinal tract. Now we're getting to the actual views of the fundic stomach, which would be pretty much the same as the body of the stomach. The fundic stomach, the first thing to note is the gastric pits, which are these structures here, they're short. They don't go that far towards the muscularis mucosae. We'll see as we go from proximal to distal, these pits get longer. And in the pyloric stomach, they're probably about 2/3 of the way down to the muscularis mucosae. These are the gastric glands here. These are the glands, and these are the pits up here. These are your simple columnar epithelium. So Spencer, we're already seeing, you see these little pinkish stain cells like here and here and here and here.
Yeah, those light pink ones.
Those are parietals. Sometimes they're described as having a fried egg appearance because it looks like the yolk in the middle, which is the nucleus, and the rest of it. So these are parietal cells. Again, they secrete hydrochloric acid, an intrinsic factor. Most of these other cells are mucus-secreting cells along with these epithelial cells. But down deeper in the gastric or fundic glands, we have chief cells. And these are mainly chief cells. At this magnification, it's a little hard to differentiate, but we'll zoom it up. Here's our muscularis mucosae and the submucosa.
Oh, what are those red dots? Like, yeah.
These are blood vessels or cross section. Looks like veins. This all may be the same vein, in fact.
Oh, those are the red blood cells inside.
That's right.
Okay.
So you can almost see the flattened endothelial cells here.
Oh, I see it.
And then, so it's in cross section, and then it's packed full of red blood cells. There's some white blood cells in there as well, but we're not really seeing them too well. But because the red blood cells are so packed in there, we can't really see them individually. We see them kind of a clump of them.
And this is non-H&E?
This is probably H&E here.
Okay.
This shows you the simple columnar lining cells. They're called mucus cells, but they don't look like goblet cells, but they do secrete mucus. This is a little pit here, so we have a gastric pit or fundic pit in this area. This is your lamina propria, and again, if we want, we could start trying to identify cells, but we have fibroblasts and we have lymphocytes and a number of other ones. We have a number of different endocrine producing cells. Sometimes they're called APUD or amine precursor update decarboxylase, but they're grouped under really diffuse neuroendocrine system. Essentially, they're going to go and release hormones into the blood. We do see parietal cells, we see mucus cells. The chief cells tend to be at the base more of the gastric glands. Now this is a beautiful picture, higher magnification. These are parietal cells. Here's one, and here's one, and here's one, and there's a bunch of them, right? They're all over the place. So these are all parietal cells. And sometimes we see them real well under the microscope, and sometimes, depending on the stain, they're a little bit harder to identify, but we can usually identify them. Sometimes they're more pinkish, orangish in color, so they have some variability. Most of these are mucus secreting cells. There's their nuclei and the mucus. But if, as we get to the base, do you see down here where they're more of a solid stain? These are chief cells down here. These here are more mucus where they have the lighter cytoplasm. So parietal cells, mucus cells, and chief cells. The chief cells produce pepsinogen. This is part of the muscularis mucosae. This is a blood vessel right here that we're seeing. These are the gastric pits with their simple columnar cells that secrete mucus. You can call these neck mucus cells or just mucus cells. This shows an even higher magnification. These are parietal cells, for instance. These are neck mucus cells, or just simply mucus cells. You can see the pale staining because of the mucus. It's not picking up the H and E stain very well. This is probably a fibroblast here with some collagen coming around. Now this may be what it looks like under your microscope. A lot of times they're a little more orangey instead of pinkish. These are parietal cells. See that they have the same shape, but they look a little more orangey here. And again, we're going to see a lot of these others are mucus secreting cells. We'd see in between some lymphocytes. For instance, here's a fibroblast. So another fibroblast. We see other types of cells that we can look at. These are collagen fibers. This would be loose connective tissue sort of in between these glands that we're seeing there.
And those light red ones are parietal?
These?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm calling them orange, but
Oh,
they are kind of red. However you want it. Reddish orange, right? All of these are parietal. Now, this is a good time to mention that in the fundus and body of the stomach, we see a lot of parietal cells. In the pyloric part, we see very few. You can see occasionally, but very few. So that's another way to help distinguish.
do we see them in the cardiac? Or
A little bit, but that's so short, it's mostly the sphincter. You
Okay.
could, but it's a very small area. So you might see occasionally. Now this again, these are parietal cells. We're looking at their shape, their structure, and you can see, depending on the stain and everything, they might look very light, pinkish, to kind of reddish, orangish. These are mucus secreting cells. And then we also have these darker ones, which are chief cells. This is sort of typical of the pyloric stomach. Look at how deep the pits are. They might come halfway to even 2/3 of the way down to the muscularis mucosae. Just to remind us a ways back, this is the fundic stomach. They only go maybe 1/3 of the way, if that, towards the muscularis mucosae. The pyloric stomach goes much further. They still have the mucus secreting cells here. But if you look here, you could see an occasional parietal cell, but they're much, much less. They're mostly mucus secreting cells with some chief cells. This we're not going to see in the microscope because this has been specially stained for the G cells which produce gastrin, the hormone. And so you're only going to see those if this is like a histochemical or stain. So here we've specially stained for the gastric G cell. The small intestine has 3 regions, the duodenum, jejunum, and the ileum. The small intestine is extremely important because most digestion and most absorption takes place in the small intestine. It's very helpful to have a large surface area. So we have different modifications to increase the surface area. The first modification is we have infoldings of the mucosa and submucosa called the plicae circularis. They infold. Then we have finger-like projections called the villi in the small intestine. Villi are only present in the small intestine. On the surface of the epithelial, simple columnar epithelial cells, we have microvilli. Microvilli we cannot see individually with the light microscope. We can see them as a group, and we can call it the brush border. But we can only see microvilli individually under the electron microscope. All of these three modifications, the plicae circularis, the villi, and the microvilli, increase the surface area by about a factor of 500, so a lot. The plicae circularis only about 2 to 3-fold, the villi about 10-fold, the microvilli about 20-fold. So when we take all those together, maybe about 500-fold. These are the villi, finger-like projections. Here is a diagram of a villus. This is the simple columnar epithelium on the surface. Here's the lumen. These will have goblet cells in them. And then in the lamina propria here, this connective tissue, we have the blood vessels, the capillaries, arterioles and capillaries, but we also have the lymph vessels. And the lymphatic vessels here in the villi are called lacteals. So they have that special name. We looked briefly at them when we looked at the cardiovascular to see what a lacteal looked like, see what a lymph vessel looked like. So we'll see that again. These show you the infolding of the mucosa and the submucosa. This is another one over here. These are the plicae circularis, these foldings of the mucosa and the submucosa. These, of course, are lymph nodules. You could even call them Peyer's patches, but lymph nodules here. This shows a scanning electron micrograph of a plicae circularis. See these foldings. Here's another folding with the submucosa coming all the way here because it's all folded in. Here's the villi. Here's the lumen out here. Here's your villi. Notice the lacteals here, here. The simple columnar epithelium goes out around this finger-like process. The villus is singular, villi are plural. This has a serosa here. You can see the flattened epithelium lining, and of course the muscularis. The glands in the small intestine and the large intestine can be called a German name, Crypts of Leberkuhn, which is just fun to say. Crypts of Leberkuhn. We should have a little, we have a little umlaut there, however you say that. They're going to be producing some mucus cells, mucus and some other things. Pannett cells, we'll get to that later, but they produce a lot of products like lysozyme and other things. This is a villus with a nice lacteal there. Again, this is part of the lamina propria coming up into the villus. And here's our simple columnar epithelium. We feel like we're real experts on goblet cells now, don't we? These are goblet cells interspersed in the simple columnar epithelium. Lots of goblet cells here that we see in this high magnification. You see this right here? That's called the brush border. The brush border is made up of microvilli. Again, we can't see under the light microscope individual villi, but as a group, they kind of look like a picket fence, it's described as sometimes. This layer right here, that's your brush border, or it can also be called your striated border. So these are the microvilli, and this whole thing here is your villus. These are your epithelial cells and your goblet cells. This is the lamina propria in the interior of a villus. This is lumen out here. Now this is under a transmission electron micrograph. Now we see we can resolve the microvilli here individually. Again, these are villi, lots of goblet cells, and we see the lamina propria core. If we look closely, we can see some lacteals, like here, lymphatics, and down here, lamina propria, muscularis mucosae, and then over here would be the submucosa. These glandular structures here can be called crypts of Lieberkühn as well.
Do the crypts just serve to increase surface area?
No, they are production, they're basically glands.
Okay.
Part of it are exocrine, mucus and the like. Part of it's endocrine, secreting hormones into the blood. But instead of just calling them intestinal glands, we can call them crypts of Lieberkühn. Okay. Eventually that name's probably gonna go away, because again, that's a proper name of somebody, right? But you'll still see that often mentioned, so we'll mention it. They're intestinal glands, essentially. This is a cross-section cut right through a villus. Here's a lacteal. This is lamina propria. This is your simple columnar epithelium with some goblet cells. So surrounded by the space of the lumen. We're seeing that. These are Paneth cells down at the base of some of these crypts. This is a nice blood vessel. You see that vein right there? These are red blood cells. Here's a smaller blood vessel. Here's another one right here.
What's that dense purple mass right next to the villi? On the other side? Yeah.
Here?
Yes.
Right there, I think might be some Paneth cells as well as these.
Okay.
These look like, I'm not sure, red blood cells lined up in a vessel, I think. Same as this, I think. But these have some granules, just like these do, so I guess these are Paneth cells here. In the first part of the small intestine, the duodenum, we have lots of mucus glands. These have a special name. They're called glands of Brunner. And again, that's a proper name, but still in heavy use. So these are Brunner's glands. They secrete mucus and help protect the small intestine. This is the pyloric junction. We're going from the stomach. See where the villi start? So we're going from the stomach to where we have villi, that's the small intestine. Here's the Brunner's gland. That's a little bit of pancreas over there, so don't get confused. The pancreas is sort of next to the duodenum. These are the Peyer's patches or lymph nodules of the ileum. These are Paneth cells again. So, I know we've gone over, so we'll do the rest of this in lab today after the quiz. And we want to go through a little bit more of the small intestine and the large intestine and the appendix and the rest. So, fellas, the rest is we'll get that. this would be looking